Wycliffe c. mid-1320s 1384, had managed to die a natural death, but 30 years later the Council of Constance in 1415 declared him a heretic and decreed that his works and earthly remains should be burned. The order, confirmed by Pope Martin V, was carried out in 1428, and Wycliffe's corpse was exhumed and burned and the ashes cast into the river Swift. Debate and religious schism over different translations of religious texts continue, as demonstrated by, for example, the King James Only Movement. A famous mistranslation of a biblical text is the rendering of the Hebrew word Karen, which has several meanings, as horn, in a context where it more plausibly means beam of light. As a result, for centuries artists, including sculptor Michelangelo, have rendered Moses the lawgiver, with horns growing from his forehead. Such fallibility of the translation process has contributed to the Islamic world's ambivalence about translating the Quran, also spelled Quran, from the original Arabic, as received by the Prophet Muhammad from Allah, God, through the angel Gabriel incrementally between 609 and 632 CE, the year of Muhammad's death. During prayers, the Quran, as the miraculous and inimitable word of Allah, is recited only in Arabic. However, as of 1936, it had been translated into at least 102 languages. A fundamental difficulty in translating the Quran accurately stems from the fact that an Arabic word, like a Hebrew or Aramaic word, may have a range of meanings, depending on context. This is said to be a linguistic feature, particularly of all Semitic languages, that adds to the usual similar difficulties encountered in translating between any two languages. There is always an element of human judgment, of interpretation, involved in understanding and translating a text. Muslims regard any translation of the Quran as but one possible interpretation of the Quranic classical Arabic text, and not as a full equivalent of that divinely communicated original. Hence such a translation is often called an interpretation, rather than a translation. To complicate matters further, as with other languages, the meanings and usages of some expressions have changed over time, between the classical Arabic of the Quran and modern Arabic. Thus, a modern Arabic speaker may misinterpret the meaning of a word or passage in the Quran. Moreover, the interpretation of a Quranic passage will also depend on the historic context of Muhammad's life and of his early community. Properly researching that context requires a detailed knowledge of Hadith and Surah, which are themselves vast and complex texts. Hence, analogously to the translating of Chinese literature, an attempt at an accurate translation of the Quran requires a knowledge not only of the Arabic language and of the target language, including their respective evolutions, but also a deep understanding of the two cultures involved. Science fiction texts being science fiction of genre with a recognizable set of conventions and literary genealogies, in which language often includes neologisms, neosemes, and invented languages, techno-scientific and pseudo-scientific vocabulary, and fictional representation of the translation process. The translation of science fiction texts involves specific issues. The science fiction translator tends to acquire specific competences and assume a distinctive publishing and cultural agency. This professional specialization and role is not often recognized by publishers and scholars, as in the case of other mass fiction genres. The translation of science fiction accounts for the transnational nature of the genre's repertoire of shared conventions and tropes. During the years after the World War II, many European countries were characterized by a wave of translations from English. Due to this prominence of English as a source language, the use of pseudonyms and pseudo-translations became common in areas such as Italy and Hungary, and English has been often used as a vehicular language to translate from languages such as Chinese and Japanese. In recent years, the international market has seen an increasing presence of source languages other than English. Technical translation renders documents such as manuals, instruction sheets, internal memos, minutes, financial reports, and other documents for a limited audience who are directly affected by the document and whose useful life is often limited. Thus, a user guide for a particular model of refrigerator is useful only for the owner of the refrigerator, and will remain useful only as long as that refrigerator model is in use. Similarly, software documentation generally pertains to a particular software whose applications are used only by a certain class of users. Language interpretation from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Jump to navigation. Jump to search. Interpreting is a translational activity in which one produces a first and final translation on the basis of a one-time exposure to an expression in a source language. The most common two modes of interpreting are simultaneous interpreting, which is done at the time of the exposure to the source language, and consecutive interpreting, which is done at breaks to this exposure. Interpreting is an ancient human activity which predates the invention of writing. However, the origins of the profession of interpreting date back to less than a century ago. Historiography research into the various aspects of the history of interpreting is quite new, for as long as most scholarly interest was given to professional conference interpreting, very little academic work was done on the practice of interpreting in history, and until the 1990s, only a few dozen publications were done on it. Considering the amount of interpreting activities that is assumed to have occurred for thousands of years, historical records are limited. Moreover, interpreters and their work have usually not found their way into the history books. One of the reasons for that is the dominance of the written text over the spoken word, in the sense that those who have left written texts are more likely to be recorded by historians. Another problem is the tendency to view it as an ordinary support activity which does not require any special attention, and the social status of interpreters, who were sometimes treated unfairly by scribes, chroniclers, and historians. Our knowledge of the past of interpreting tends to come from letters, chronicles, biographies, diaries, and memoirs, along with a variety of other documents and literary works, many of which, and with few exceptions, were only incidentally or marginally related to interpreting. Etymology. Many Indo-European languages have words for interpreting and interpreter, expressions in Germanic, Scandinavian, and Slavic languages denoting an interpreter can be traced back to Akkadian, around 1900 BCE. The Akkadian root Turgamanu also gave rise to the term dragoman, via an etymological sideline from Arabic. The English word interpreter, however, is derived from Latin interpres, meaning expounder, person, explaining what is obscure, whose semantic roots are not clear. Some scholars take the second part of the word to be derived from parte separatium, meaning price, which fits the meaning of a middleman, intermediary, or commercial go-between, but others have suggested a Sanskrit root, medes, consecutive and consecutive interpreting. C. The interpreter starts to interpret when the speaker pauses. Therefore, the time needed is much greater, possibly double the time needed. Traditionally, the interpreter will sit or stand near the speaker. Consecutive interpretation can be conducted in a pattern of short or long segments, according to the interpreter's preference. In short C, the interpreter relies mostly on memory, whereas, in long C, most interpreters will rely on note-taking. The notes must be clear and legible in order to not waste time on reading themis or consecutive interpreting of whole thoughts, rather than in small pieces, is desirable so that the interpreter has the whole meaning before rendering it in the target language. This affords a truer, more accurate, and more accessible interpretation than where short C or simultaneous interpretation is used. An attempt at consensus about lengths of segments may be reached prior to commencement, depending upon complexity of the subject matter and purpose of the interpretation, though speakers generally face difficulty adjusting to unnatural speech patterns. On occasion, document side translation is required of the interpreter during consecutive interpretation.